Hello, and welcome to Voices in Leadership from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. My name is Eric Anderson, the director of this program, and I welcome you to another exciting installment. Our goal with Voices in Leadership is to focus on effective leadership to create positive change in public health. Today we welcome Dan Glickman, former Secretary of Agriculture serving in President Bill Clinton's cabinet from 1995 to 2001. Before his appointment as Secretary of Agriculture, he served for 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives for the 4th Congressional District of Kansas. Secretary Glickman served as chairman of the Motion Picture Association of America from 2004 to 2010. Prior to his appointment at the MPAA, he was the director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. Secretary Glickman is a senior counselor and chair of the International Advisory Board at APCO Worldwide. He also serves as a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a DC-based think tank that fosters bipartisanship. Secretary Glickman is an adjunct professor of agriculture and nutrition at Tufts University. In our program today, Secretary Glickman will talk about his unique leadership journey, with a particular focus on work with nutrition and agriculture and the impact on climate change and public health. He will be joined in conversation with Harvard T.H. Chan professor Walter Willett. Dr. Willett is the most cited nutritionist internationally. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of the Sciences and the recipient of many national and international awards for his research. Professor Willett, I turn this discussion over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and welcome to you, Secretary Glickman. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you, Professor Willett. It's always an honor to be with you. I'm always reminded of the old story about the two dairy cows that are grazing along the side of the road, and a milk truck drives by, and on the side of the milk truck is written in big red letters, pasteurized, homogenized, vitamin enriched, good for you. And one dairy cow looks at the other dairy cow and says, kind of makes you feel inadequate, doesn't it? And so that's the way I feel with you. You're the undisputed leader in many of these topics. So it's just a great honor to be with you.
Well, thank you. And we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. You've recently written a memoir about your life and leadership journey. In fact, thanks to Amazon, I just got my copy and I'm about halfway through. Here it is for those of you who are interested. And it's called, interestingly, Laughing at Myself. That's a pretty unique title, but that's what the book includes quite a bit. You've had a remarkable life beginning, as you say, as a Jewish boy from Kansas to the US Congress, to the President's Cabinet as Secretary of Agriculture, to the President of the Motion Picture Association of America, and beyond, right to where you are today. Upon reflection, what did you learn about yourself, and what are the key lessons you can share about effective leadership?
Well, I had good parents, so sometimes, you can't control that, but in my case, I was lucky. And they were unconditionally supportive. And they also had this incredibly good sense of humor and self-deprecating humor, non-bullying humor, non-mean humor. And so I found that humor was a great tool of leadership, particularly when you got into problems or got into a jam that you needed to get out of. And so since likability is such an important part in politics and getting things done, that sense of humor was a big part of it. And the other thing I learned in life is resilience, is that, you may be up one day and you may be down the next day. But the question is that when you're down, can you get back up again? And so those two things has been part of my life and my life's career, particularly as I've been involved in public service.
In your book, you talk specifically about the importance of humor in leadership. As you just mentioned, you quote Yakov Smirnov, who said laughter is the shortest distance between two people, which is an interesting comment. Can you maybe be a little more explicit and give some examples about how you use humor and how effective it was?
Well, what I've done is it's more experiential. So it's like I was the most assaulted member of the cabinet. So people used to throw things at me, mostly food, and mostly rotten or infected or food that you couldn't eat. Or in one case, genetically modified seeds were thrown at me because they didn't like the fact that I had encouraged some research in that area. And I made kind of not a joke about it, but I made it part of the human experience. I understood how strongly people felt about food. I'll never forget. I was at a national nutrition summit, and a lady threw a tofu cream pie at me, Walt, and she called me a pimp for the meat industry, and then she threw the pie at me, and I ducked deftly, and Donna Shalala and Bob Dole were on the platform with me, and the pie hit Donna on the side of the shoulder, in which case I looked over at Bob Dole from my home state of Kansas. I said, Bob, I don't think we're in Kansas any longer. And the place, laughed hysterically, and it kind of diffused the tension. And so they're just a myriad of things that I talk about, how laughter and good-natured humor can diffuse tensions. And in our politics today, we're almost in a humorless society. If you look at our national politicians of both political parties, there are not a lot of people who I would call warm, fuzzy, and human in that process.
Yes, and in your book, you lament the deep political divide our country has today, where we have a Trump-led Republican Party that largely rejects science on such key issues as climate change, vaccine control of pandemics. Actually, maybe you have a different perspective, but it did seem to me that President Obama had a pretty good sense of humor, but that wasn't enough to avoid Republicans blocking nearly every proposal just for political reasons. Some of this seems to be baked into our Constitution, because we give sparsely populated states, which are mainly Republican as it happens, the same number of senators as New York and California, in very disproportional weight in our electoral college. And this, combined with the filibuster, means that a small percentage of the population can block legislation that's critical to the future of our country and the world, and even when it's supported by a large majority of Americans. We can see this playing out even this week, even today. Your book, though, exudes optimism, but is this realistic given our Constitution? I think I sense a lot of really somewhat depression among people in our community.
Well, of course, I kind of, the optimism is in my DNA and my bloodstream, and maybe it's unrealistic, and maybe it's coming from the Depression era parents and grandparents who you came to this country with nothing and made something out of their lives. And, it's kind of like, well, they can do it, everybody can. And I know that's not always very realistic in this country. But going back to your question, it's funny, the Constitution in basically ingrains gridlock within our founding fathers' documents. So you think about it, and we have, although the filibuster is not in our Constitution, that's a matter of custom that occurred later, but our electoral college, 2 senators in every state, whether you're in California or Wyoming, and the whole issue of separation of powers, it's all built to basically, it came out of the reaction to the European system of too much power in the executive branch. And so when the founding fathers put together our country, they kind of wanted one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator at all time, because they wanted to protect individual liberties, so to speak, especially against an excessively strong executive. And, we saw in President Trump kind of test that a little bit. And so there was some wisdom in what they've done. But today we see the problems of our country and our world so monumental and so great that, sometimes I do think it's time to look back into our to our structural system. For example, I think we ought to abolish the Electoral College. I think that the president ought to be elected by everybody. I don't think we ought to change the way our states vote and the number of senators. I mean, we could argue that that's maybe isn't as totally fair, but that's never going to change. I can tell you that. But the Electoral College is a very bad idea. It produces perfidious impact if people want to start screwing around with state election integrity, which we also saw in the last election. So I think there are some things we can do, and we can certainly modify the filibuster to some degree. But I think what we've seen, Walt, is that it works. Our system works fine, but when things really get difficult and when we have these monumental problems, unless we can reach consensus, which we were able to do until about really the Vietnam War was the end of what I call the consensus period in our society. It's just tough to get anything done, and we just kind of grind ourselves to a screeching halt, and that's not good for the long-term view of America.
Yes, and especially on top of that, when basically everything in time is revved up by communications and things happen and change in speed that was unimaginable when you had to go by horseback or stagecoach around the country.
Yeah,
So,
you know, and the other thing, of course, is local media, local television, and local newspapers have just diminished in power and authority. They're now, where they exist, they're part of big national, massive chains of, you know, tens of dozens of TV stations or newspapers, and that also used to be a place where people would get a lot of their information, and now that's changed by use of social media, as well as a national television, which is massively different. And people tend to watch the shows that they're inclined to agree with, and not the shows that they disagree with.
right, all this is, yeah, creating huge challenges, and as you say, in developing consensus. Do you think it's at all possible to change or really get rid of the Electoral College? It does seem like you're asking people who have power to give up power. That doesn't happen very easily.
Yeah, look, it's tough because that does require a constitutional change, although there's some discussion that you could have these state compacts, that if enough states would agree to abide by the national electoral vote, then you wouldn't need a constitutional amendment. But I think that's probably pretty remote that we go down this world. I think we should continue trying to do that. But in the meantime, what we need to focus on is fairness in the election process, to make sure that people have trust and that the elections are on the level, which by and large they are, that demagogues don't try to use every election as a way to demonstrate that it was fraudulent, which has begun to happen in certain number of states. I mean, that's the kind of thing that really can destroy democracy and destroy the trust that, you know, people have in their government. Yesterday, I was listening to the radio, and there was this guy on the radio who said that Trump was actually the president. Biden wasn't the president. Trump was the president. We all know that. He's running the country. And I'm thinking, how can this possibly happen in a society that, you know, values its institutions like we have? But it has, and it's very troubling.
Indeed. To shift a little bit to the time when you were Secretary of Agriculture, and I paid particular attention to that chapter in your book, since that impinges on a lot of work that we do. You were inevitably put in the middle of powerful interests, and some of them conflicting by design, or just the way it evolved. There are powerful interests from the beef, the sugar industries, other commodity industries. And these are supported by this highly unbalanced Senate that we talked about, that does favor sparsely populated Western states. But at the same time, the Department of Agriculture is supposed to be supporting the nutrition and well-being of America. And this all, in fact, worked pretty well until recent times, when the main issue was we needed more food. But now we obviously have a pandemic of obesity and chronic disease. And I've wondered, and I found it very difficult to really imagine, how can a Secretary of Agriculture be in a position to both promote health and well-being, and at the same time having all these powerful agricultural interests at the door. This is tough.
Very tough. And, there's an old thing that political theory is the rationalization of economic self-interest. And I learned that in college. And so, everybody's deserving, of course, of their own economic self-interest. And you get all these conflicting forces into the public policy arena. And they're impacted by a lot of things, like money and politics gives certain people more power in the system than, let's say, maybe an average citizen might otherwise have, or that public health groups might have. I mean, I doubt that the Harvard School of Public Health has a major PAC that delivers a lot of money to individual members of Congress, although they have influence in other ways. So, but the one thing I am beginning to see is that consumers generally are much more interested in what they eat, where it's grown, how it's grown, and what its nutritional value is. And the medical profession, which heretofore has treated patients only once they're sick, is beginning to become much more interested in how to prevent illness. And I'm not just talking about doctors, but other healthcare professionals. And of course, we're talking as part of a school of public health right now, so I'm seeing some positive trends. Now, a traditional production agriculture has not really been very engaged in public health issues. And I would say the reverse is kind of true, as public health community has often not been engaged in production agriculture, and to try to see if there are collaborations that can take place and produce healthier food and more sustainably produced and more environmentally produced and more traditionally nutritionally produced food. But, this is now being impacted by just as you talked about just a moment ago, the rampant increase in diet-related diseases and preventable diseases, in part caused by our diet. I think the Rockefeller Foundation last year came out with a report that said that poor diet is the leading cause of early mortality in the world. And I'm sure it's in the United States as well. So, I do think that more and more people are talking about how can we produce food and give a good income to our farmers and producers, but at the same time do a better job of producing higher quality food, more nutritionally higher value food, and getting consumers better educated in what they eat. And this is a really complicated problem, but it is not one that passed me by when I was Secretary of Agriculture. So I had jurisdiction over all the farm programs, but I had also jurisdiction over all the school feeding programs and the SNAP program, and yes, quite frankly, they often had conflicting public policy positions. And even programs that serve the poor, the SNAP programs, a lot of times they weren't very interested in prevention either. They just were more interested in quantity of food that was going into the programs, how many dollars we were spending on SNAP, rather than what the kind of food people ought to be eating, both rich and poor, whether they were on SNAP or not on SNAP. So this is a great avenue for public policy discussion. But I do think that at least the discussion is now occurring sensibly and responsibly. And we didn't talk about this 20 or 30 years ago.
Right. As you say, this is on the front burners in terms of policy questions and debate at this point, partly because the situation has gotten so much worse that we are on an unrelenting path toward more obesity, up to 42% now, and declining life expectancy that's to a considerable degree driven by the obesity epidemic that we're having. By going back to the sort of conflict of interest issue, that the dietary recommendations really encapsulated by the US dietary guidelines do sort of represent a playing field, one might say, where these conflicts of interest come together. For example, the 2020 guidelines, US dietary guidelines, promote environmentally unsustainable, heavy consumption of meat and dairy foods. These guidelines ignored the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report that suggests reduction in red meat in the Mediterranean and vegetarian diets could be healthy. Basically, the scientific committee that produces the dietary, that reviews the evidence and is the advisory committee, concluded that you could have what they called a healthy American diet or Mediterranean diet and vegetarian diet. And that committee then gives, as has been done in the last few cycles, gives their 400-page report of the scientific evidence to the USDA and HHS, who then package this into the final guidelines. And of course, you know all that. I'm just mentioning that for our listeners. But it's at that last step, when the USDA has really had their hands on it, the scientific report's been twisted. And the vegetarian diet and the Mediterranean diet, which almost for sure are healthier than the more animal-based dairy food and meat diets, those more healthy diets were really just ignored. And the recommendations came out saying 3 servings of dairy a day and about 4 times more servings of meat than nuts, legumes, and soy products, which flipping that around there's lots of evidence that would be better from a health standpoint. And of course, sustainability, effect on the environment, is totally not part of the excluded from the dietary guidelines by an act of Congress. That in 2015, the beef industry got legislation in the last final appropriations bill to say if the USDA says anything about sustainability, their budget will be slashed. And of course, that nothing was said about sustainability. So given these huge interests, the beef industry acting through Senate, how can we really trust the guidelines at all when they should be based on science for health and sustainability? In fact, I must admit, I just made a slide with a cover of the USDA 2020 guidelines and put a big red X through that cover, because I don't think it can be trusted if it's really influenced by politics. So I don't know, how do we get around this?
Well, first of all, Walt, and you've written extensively on this, everything's covered by politics. So there's just no way to remove politics from policy, because that's 90% of the word policy is politics and vice versa. So you're always going to have politics. And there's nothing wrong with that. People fight for their economic self-interest and self-preservation. So you just have to do the best you can under the circumstances. Now, the guidelines today are much better than the guidelines were 25 and 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
So there has been a recognition about eating more fruits and vegetables and processed foods and sodium, and other kinds of things. They haven't probably moved as fast as you might like, or even I might like, but there has been some movement, and there are at least scientists in the decision-making process. Now, when it gets back up to the USDA level and HHS level, although USDA probably is the lead in these guidelines, to be honest with you, you do take advantage of the account of the fact of the following: half the proceeds in American agriculture are in livestock. Half. Okay, so that means it's just, in some sense, this is the heart or one of the hearts of the production agriculture system. So how do you modify that? How do you change that when in fact it has such a great economic impact? And it's not just in the West and the South where livestock. I mean, dairy is all over the country in every single state in America, from Florida to Vermont to California and everywhere in between. So you have a lot of these interests that are just national, but the positive thing, if there is one, and I think there is one, is that people are beginning to talk about the old "you are what you eat," that in fact your health is in fact related to what you consume. But there are a lot of other factors here. One of the factors is marketing and advertising of food. So if I watch a lot of television, in fact, if I had been born today as opposed to 76 years ago, I probably couldn't even be on the show and talk to you because my brain would be fried by all of the television I've been watching and all the advertising. But if you look at advertising and marketing in food, both television and to some extent social media, most of the advertising is in high caloric, high sodium, high fat, tasty looking foods. You don't see blueberries or strawberries advertised on television because there's no money in advertising it. Now, there used to be these marketing orders where the little bit of money would be spent on the dancing strawberries, I think, or the dancing raspberries, but that didn't account for very much. So the messages that people are getting from the food industry historically and in even recent times are to eat foods that have nutritional values that are probably insufficient to what they really are need. So that's a factor outside of traditional agriculture. That's the food industry to some extent pushing that because they make more money doing and producing the kinds of foods that they're doing. But again, the positive side of this is the consumers of this country and the medical profession and the nutrition world is beginning to have some impact into what people are eating. Our school meals are now better than they used to be 30 and 40 years ago. I remember, I don't know, I'm not sure how old you are, but I suspect we're within a relatively even age. I remember eating in my school cafeteria and seeing those tiny thin slices of roast beef, and you could see the colors of the rainbow in there. And I assume that meant there was an awful lot of grease and fat in those meals. Those have gotten a lot better. Kids and what we serve kids is at least gotten a higher amount of attention. So I don't disagree with you on your basic premise, but I do think that the more focus we have by people outside of traditional production agriculture, these issues, it really makes a big difference. Napoleon said that war is too important to be left to the generals. And in this case, food and agriculture policy is too important to be left to just the people who produce food. It doesn't mean they shouldn't be a part of the debate. They have to be part of the debate because that's from whence the food products come from. But we need outside actors also involved in this public policy debate.
Yes, and you made some really important points. There have been some very positive changes, and probably the most striking was the improvement in quality of food served in schools, which you mentioned. And the USDA did issue a report just a year or so ago showing that on a scale of 0 to 100, the quality of foods served to kids in schools went from 58 to 81, which is a huge change in just 4 years with the implementation of standards for foods served in schools. So that's, yes, you and I ate out of the same cafeteria, I think. And it's
you remember that with those roast beef, right?
Oh yeah,
colors of the rainbow in there.
Pretty dismal when I look back. Well, here we are. We've survived. do you think there are any solutions in getting the USDA to support diets that are more plant-based? And just as one example, the dietary guidelines recommend 3 servings of dairy a day. And I grew up in Michigan and Wisconsin and dairy families. So I know that we should have 5 servings a day. But when we look at the data, there's no basis that we have to have 3 servings of dairy a day. And if we're right now, the average intake is 1.6 servings a day. So if we really follow the USDA guidelines, that would mean doubling dairy production in the United States, which, as you know, there's already a huge footprint environmentally from dairy, and yet we're told we should be doubling it. When all the evidence and environment and climate change is an existential issue at this point in time, and to have the USDA just completely ignoring it in their guidelines. Now, they are doing other things, I understand, but it seems like we're missing something very important. Is there any hope for change, or what can we do?
Yeah, well, first of all, you do mention USDA does a lot in the area of conservation, soil health. There's now an effort to try to reduce the amount of pesticides and herbicides and crop inputs to a lower level to prevent environmental contamination. And so, and a lot of farmers now and the land grant colleges are doing a much better job of training people how to be better stewards of their land. So, there is a positive thing. I think you make one interesting point, and I'm not an expert on the dairy issue, but one of the things that I have found in my years in public service, and especially as affects agriculture as food, is the relatively low level of dollars and expenditures we spend on research into nutrition and food consumption. So USDA has food research laboratories. There's one at Tufts University that focuses on aging. There's one in the University of California, Davis. But by and large, the amount of dollars that go into research on nutrition has not been going up at all. In fact, the total agriculture research dollars has not been going up very much. And we used to spend some resources at the NIH looking at health and research. In fact, there were people in the director's office that were focused on nutrition. And then they were slowly removed out of that office and moved into the endocrinology department. And then it became a kind of a secondary priority. So one of the things I've been working along with Dean Mazafarian at the Tufts School of Nutrition is to try to highlight nutritional research as part of the NIH's portfolio because it relates to disease. It relates to communicable and non-communicable diseases, what you eat. And to get USDA more involved in this collaborative research that needs to be done. And so we don't look, so even the questions of dairy, for example, well, you will have dairy scientists that will come and argue that no, dairy is extremely important in your diet, and reduction of consumption of milk products as you get older is one of the reasons that people suffer from various diseases, because they don't get the level of calcium that they got as a kid, even though we may or may not need it. And I've listened to those discussions, and in many cases I say, well, who's right on the research? Because there's conflicting research. And a lot of it is, of course, research that's pushed forward for economic interest purposes. I understand that as well. So we need to vastly increase the amount of resources we put into understanding nutrition. And that will be helpful, because with that data, it's going to be a lot easier for the food industry to want to accommodate increasing needs from the public. To be honest with you, what I have found is there are a lot of forces in the food industry that really want to try to do the right thing, but they're moved by taste, by price, and by other forces in agriculture as well. So I'm not trying to make the problem so overly complicated. I'm just saying that there are many
realities.
the realities is whoever said for every complicated problem there is a simple and a wrong solution is certainly met its match when they look at the food and agriculture industry.
Extraordinarily complicated issues. And you would have very receptive audience here for more money in research and nutrition. So I hope that would come to be.
And you know what? One thing I might add is the medical community, and you're a physician, right?
Right.
You know, so when you look at medical schools and how professionals in the medical profession are trained, up until fairly recently, it was a low priority to teach prevention. And of course, the physicians and other providers aren't really compensated for prevention. I mean, the Medicare program hardly pays doctors anything, and they're not going to pay you to spend much time talking about, you know, how you should prevent disease. They will focus on treating disease, and I'm glad they have some of these medications because I take some of them myself. But how to get our medical education and our reimbursement system and insurance to focus more on preventing a disease and keeping people alive longer without having to be treated with these very serious illnesses. That's a subject we've never really dealt with very directly. And, you know, and so I have my own personal experiences with, I had one physician that I went to and he had Jolly Rancher candies out there as I paid my bill. And I think maybe it kept the bills going. Let me tell you that, those candies. And so there are a lot of pieces of this puzzle is what I'm saying.
Right. And the lack of medical education incorporating nutrition is something that we are working on at the moment. And you're absolutely right. There's a huge void when this is the number one, poor nutrition is the number one cause of morbidity and mortality in the country and the world, as you mentioned earlier. And we're hardly teaching it at all. In fact, I'm giving we used to have a first year session on prevention, including nutrition at Harvard Medical School, and we even lost that in the name of curriculum reform. And I'm giving a talk to medical students next week at Harvard, but it's a handful of people who are doing this on their own time because they realize they're not getting it, which isn't the way it should be. But one good news is that Jim McGovern, the representative from Massachusetts, we have a little working group, and we with Harvard Law School discovered that medical education gets $10 billion a year without any requirements or strings on it. And Representative McGovern, who controls those purse strings by his position in Congress, is prepared to say to medical schools and hospitals that they need to include teaching on nutrition if they're going to be getting those $10 billion. So we'll see that there is a lever there.
He certainly is one of the few real advocates for understanding this subject, not only in terms of his support for the basic federal nutrition programs, but also for understanding the role of nutrition in health policy. And one thing I might mention, again, I've been working with Dean Mozaffarian of Tufts and others on this particular issue is that, you know, in 1969, we held this White House conference on food and nutrition. Largely, I think the catalyst was Tufts and the dean was Jean Mayer at that time. And as a result of that conference, a lot of programs were created, like the school meals programs, and SNAP was largely created in its current form. And it was during the Nixon administration, and you know, it was just fascinating how this one conference served as a catalyst to get so many of these programs going over all these years. And so we meaning Tufts and others that are, you know, chefs like Chef Jose Andres, and there's various former Senator Harkin and others, and trying to see if we can get a subsequent White House conference on food, nutrition, and health to look at some of these issues again. And this time it will be as much focused on the relationship between nutrition and health. The earlier conference was really focused on the poor, nutrition programs, and providing enough access for people to get basic food. It grew out of the early days in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of just abject hunger in the United States. And today the problems have to do much more with nutrition-related diseases and the relationship with diet and health. And so that's something that I don't know if we're going to get it done or not, but we're trying to get the White House to take a look at this.
Right, that would be, it's hard to know what would come of that, but it's certainly a good aim, given the impact of the first White House conference 50 years ago. And it is true that the previous conference was focused on poverty and inadequate nutrition, but it is striking that still, even this epidemic of what's sometimes called excess, it's definitely burdening mostly low-income, primarily everybody, but to a much greater degree, low-income Americans who are, for many reasons, having diets that are very inferior in quality and contribute to the all these diseases we're seeing, including through obesity, hypertension, and diabetes, contributing to COVID deaths even. So the problem is the social justice aspect of this is just as real as it was 50 years ago.
Absolutely.
One other major issue, again, going back to environment, is carbon sequestration. That we all know the biggest issue is that we need to almost eliminate fossil fuel consumption. And a lot is going on in that area, and it deserves even more emphasis. And what we have shown, documented, that if we don't shift our diets toward more plant-based globally, even if we eliminate fossil fuels, we will still not be able to stay under 2 degrees centigrade warming. But if we did adopt a more plant-based diet, it would allow us to, if everything else works right, to stay under 2 degrees centigrade warming. So shift in diet toward more plant-based is a necessary but not sufficient objective or part of the solution.
I agree, and I'd say 2 things here. One is I think we're going to see more of a shift to a plant-based diet, and I also think we're going to see more of a shift towards sustainable meat production. So the current system of meat production in this country overall is an industrial system where at least cattle are largely fed in feedlots, not always, but in many cases, or large containment operations for poultry and hogs. And it's kind of, a lot of that has had to do with the scale in agriculture, how expensive it is to family farm. And so a lot of that has just kind of happened kind of naturally in the process without necessarily saying that there's any evil forces there. But more and more consumers I think consumers will always demand meat. I don't think we're going to have a meatless society in this world, but I think consumers will demand meat that is, I'd say, produced in much better, more environmentally sound practices, where methane's reduced, where soil is being treated better, where we have more grass-fed beef, and other meats where possible, where we use no-till practices on soil rather than regurgitating the soil every year and which releases a lot of carbon into the soil. I mean, these are practices. There's a whole industry now developed, and private sector entrepreneurial industry, to look at producing food much more in an environmentally sound way and using less water. If you ask me what the biggest environmental problem facing agriculture, it's water. 70% of the water in the world is used to produce to grow plants and feed animals, 70%. And now it's higher in some parts of the world and lower in other parts of the world. But the area of the country where I came from has this giant underground lake that runs from North Dakota all the way down to Texas, called the Ogallala Aquifer. And there are aquifers all over the United States, and they're being depleted very rapidly because of the way we plant corn largely to feed animals. So we're going to have to figure out how to use less water to do everything in agriculture. And that's going to take research. It's going to take changes in irrigation patterns. It's going to take new technologies to grow plants, maybe to look at photosynthesis, for example, how we grow plants to grow them faster. And that's why I've been an advocate of responsible use of new technologies like genetic engineering, because like in medicine, I don't think you can have an agriculture that deals with these things environmentally soundly and sustainably without using science as your friend. And that's sometimes not always easy to do in the politics of today's world.
Right. I think you point out that the challenge is so big, we need to use all these technologies, all these approaches. Although the biggest one, when we analyzed it, was instead of running what is about half of all the grain and soy produced in the United States, running it through animals, if we just ate those foods directly, we would have massive impact on the requirement for water. And then add that. That's again not going to be the whole solution, but added to all the other approaches you mentioned, what we eat it looks like it has the biggest impact.
Well, and part of that's been because our farm programs since the Depression have been largely built on 5 row crops: wheat, corn, cotton, rice, and soybeans. Right. And that's what we've supported. And only recently have we realized that no, there are a lot of other crops that could be grown, and diversification in agriculture is really important. In many cases, we have forced people, because of our farm programs, to grow certain crops and raise the type of animals we do just because of the way we subsidize agriculture. And I think there's some changing happening there as well.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The system has been set up. So if I know this from our family farm in Michigan, which is still in the family, that people are planting pretty much nothing but soy and corn, and they do it because that's what makes it work financially for them, given the system that we've set up. It's hard and risky to go into other kinds of productions that would be nutritionally more desirable. Staying on the sustainability issue a little bit, and you touched on some of this, again, looking at how do we stay under 2 degrees centigrade. If you look at the map, the plans that the IPCC has laid out, it assumes a massive amount of carbon capture from the agriculture system, and including forestry. But we probably, looking into this, it seems like there's tremendous disagreement and debate about how to do this and what works. And of course, part of the answer is what you said earlier regarding nutrition, is more research to do this more effectively. But I don't know if you got into this at all and have any thoughts about how we can help support basically sustainable agriculture from and carbon sequestration more specifically.
Well, first of all, one subject we didn't mention, which relates to this, is food waste. So we produce about 30%, maybe 35% more food than we actually end up consuming. We ending up throwing a lot of it away or not using it in a productive sense. And so there you have almost a third of the food production is not consumed. So that adds a lot to the dissemination of carbon into the atmosphere. And that's something that a lot of community groups are working on, but it really does take a national effort to try to figure out how to how to reduce food waste in the food production scheme. The second thing has to do with what kind of incentives we can give producers who resist mandates coming from Uncle Sam, but sometimes need them, but they often are politically resisted. What kind of incentives can we give producers to try to engage in carbon healthy practices? I mentioned no-till, which is an old, not a new technology. It's been used for hundreds of years, where you don't tear up the soil every year. But and there are some financial issues, incentives, whether we carbon credits, carbon taxes, trading carbon from non-agriculture to agriculture and back. A lot of these are very complicated, and I don't know how well they would actually work. But we've got to figure out new and innovative ways to help producers of food to produce less carbon into the atmosphere. And it's going to take a combination of incentives and some mandates to get this done. But, you know, agriculture has always resisted being told what to do. I don't see that changing very much in the often. But the good news is younger farmers are getting with the act. Newer and younger farmers are recognizing that they can't necessarily produce food the same way that their parents and grandparents did.
Well, yes, and you're quite right that farmers shouldn't be expected to carry all this weight themselves when this climate change is something that affects all of us, and it's totally reasonable that we all pay for carbon sequestration and producing food sustainably. It's a societal issue, not just something that rests on the farmer's back. And it is interesting that this is something where there is one of the few areas where you can get bipartisan support. And if I'm correct, there was just a appropriation that was approved by Congress with something like 90% of the senators supporting it to use, I think, about $25 billion to pay farmers instead of just giving them the money. It would to pay them to practice better farming practices that were more meant to sequester carbon. How well we do that, how well it actually works, and how well we keep it in the ground seems to be an area that where we really do need more research.
You know, this is a kind of an interesting anecdote. I just went back to Kansas for reason to visit friends and relatives, but when I flew into the Wichita airport, I could see hundreds and hundreds of windmills. Okay, now that's new. When I was in Congress, the only windmills you see were the ones that were built during the Depression to bring water up. And in many cases, I talked to some of these farmers, they're actually getting more on their royalties from their wind energy than they're getting on the food production that they're getting. It's not without some controversy. There's some people that think that has some negative environmental impacts, especially with respect to species and birds and other kinds of things. But there are a lot of, even with all the worry about the environmental degradation of our atmosphere and the role of agriculture, there is a huge amount of innovation occurring out there in the private sector, as well as even in the land grant colleges, to get us to turn off of our path that we've been going on in the last 50 years, and we can't sustain that. And I also echo your point that this is a massive issue. It's not just agriculture. A lot of people blame agriculture for the problems, and agriculture is responsible for certainly a piece of this, but not the whole piece.
Yes, huge challenges. And interestingly, when I was back in Michigan 2 years ago, I had the same experience that all around our family farm there are windmills now, and my cousin's trying to get a few on our land there. Basically, the farmer gets about $10,000 a year per windmill, which having a few windmills makes a big difference on the bottom line. of a farming operation these days when everything is really tight budget-wise. So that was one great crop that seemed to be sprouting up and doing very well there, which is, of course, very good. Just going back a little bit more to the broader context of leadership, our graduates at our School of Public Health, whether they're specifically envisioning themselves as leaders, many of them do, but many of them find themselves in leadership positions, whether they plan for it or not, because they're responsible and highly qualified people. What can you maybe give a few more messages going back to your original theme? Anything else you might want to add? You talked about resilience, you talked about humor. Anything else that you'd like to convey?
Yeah, of course, I've got lots of things in my book. Don't burn bridges, don't build walls, keep relationships going. When things turn bad, if you haven't made any enemies, you're going to end up a lot better than if you've made enemies, because then the doors close on you and you're really bad shape. But just a quick note on public health, because I think our time is just about ending as I'm looking at the chat right now, is that this is this field of public health is so important. And you see what's happening in the whole COVID area, how our public health professionals are being attacked in many places around the country for really trying just to do the right thing, get people inoculated, give them information, getting them vaccinated up. And I think that the public health community is got to be more engaged in a lot of the medical decisions that are being made in this country, because so much disease is public health related, and yet so much of medicine is not public health related. It's treatment of disease related, and that's good. As we get older, most of us will get sicker, and we like these new cures, but we want to live longer and healthier lives before we get older as well. And so the school ought to be really thinking about ways where it can expand its influence into other fields, other lines of work, and I give my hats off to people in this public health community, in this public health world, when today so many people are rejecting science and so many people are denying the value of vaccines and feeding veterinary worm disease to people who are, let's say, suffering from COVID. It's just extraordinary. And let's just hope that we can get our act together as a country and get down on the right path.
Well, thank you, Dan. That's a great conclusion. We appreciate your support. And thank you for joining our conversation today. We've learned a lot about you and your leadership journey, and I hope you will visit us at Longwood in person in the near future. Also, thank you to our viewers. Please stay tuned for more Voices in Leadership. You can tune in on October 27th for the next program featuring the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark. Until then, thank you for watching and be well.
Thank you.